Welcome to the inaugural episode of DRI Majlis, the Diplomat Risk Intelligence's monthly webinar. My name is Avi Reg. I'm DRI's Director of Research. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated global adoption of digital technologies, and the Asia-Pacific is no different. Countries across the region have been forced to shift more towards working, living, and learning online. All of this has contributed to an already complex, ever-evolving cyber risk landscape. Geopolitics and increasingly geopolitical rivalry between China on one hand and the United States and its allies and partners on the other also continue to contribute to this murky landscape. With growing cyber espionage, probing of critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, and supply chain concentrations, there is a general sense of insecurity in the region. Meanwhile, cybercriminals, emboldened by the rise of cryptocurrencies and difficult to trace modes of financial transactions, have vastly increased the scope of operation, with deployment of ransomware becoming commonplace. And finally, Asia-Pacific continues to suffer from a lack of digital hygiene, awareness, and capacity deficit, all of which continues to contribute to this witch's cauldron. Earlier this month, DRI released a report on the state of play of cyber in Asia-Pacific. The report is available at dri.thediplomat.com. To complement analysis presented in that report, we are joined by three leading experts, Gunjan Chawla, Elena Noor, and Justin Sherman. Gunjan is Program Manager, Technology and National Security Program at the Center for Communication Governance, National Law University, Delhi, and Postdoctoral Research Fellow, Center on National Security and Law, Georgetown University Law Center. Elena is Director of Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Asia Society Policy Institute. And finally, Justin is a fellow at the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative, a Wired magazine columnist. Justin also served as lead consultant on the DRI report. Let me start with you, Gunjan. Can you please survey the state of play of cyber in South Asia with a focus on strategy, security, norms, and the gaps that exist across the region, across countries in the region, rather. It would also be great if you could give us your thoughts on whether South Asia has adequate voice in global conversations around cyber norm making and cyber stability.
Sorry, I just realized I was on mute. Can you hear me? Can you see me clearly? Great, thanks. Thank you so much for having me, Abhigan. It's a pleasure to be here with such distinguished co-panelists. And let me just jump right to it. The state of play as far as the cyber risks landscape goes is very much indeed rocky, as you have very rightly captured in the theme for today's webinar. We've seen an upward trends in malware, in phishing, in spam, in ransomware attacks as well. I think probably one of the few phenomena that are on the downside this year has been botnets, where institutions like the Cyber Swachhta Kendra that we have as part of our government's cyber security architecture has been successful in taking down some of these networks, creating inauthentic traffic and content. I think one of the big learnings from last year, and this departs significantly from the broad trend of cybersecurity suffering from a hindsight bias, because it is very difficult to predict and project what are the new kinds of threats and threat vectors that we're going to see in the coming months. And I think after SolarWinds, supply chain security is something that has been on the top of the list of almost any enterprise that you will speak to. Of course, if we turn our gaze a little bit more focused towards India, I think one of the biggest increases that we've seen is in unauthorized scanning and probing of networks, which of course has been noted by our computer emergency response team at the national level, and very clearly points to an upward trend in espionage that is going on within networks of the state. And of course, we cannot speak of espionage and sabotage in the context of South Asia without making at least one reference to our not so friendly neighbors on the north and the eastern sides. And of course, that the establishment is clearly cognizant of this threat being existing, but we have seen in recent months, or rather, I think this is a trend that goes back at least 2 years, that there is a certain reluctance at the national level to, explicitly attribute cyber incidents or attacks to the Chinese. If we turn our gaze to the western borders of India, I think and to borrow your vocabulary, Abhigyan, I think the state of play has been lower level cyber incidents involving, defacement of websites that happen almost on a habitual pattern between Indian and Pakistani personnel that are working in this field. As far as strategy to deal with these rising and evolving threats go, of course, many of us are eagerly waiting for the public release of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, a process that started in November of 2019, if I recall correctly. And halfway into 2021, we've been hearing officials at the national level assuring journalists who will ask this question to them that it is awaiting clearance at the highest levels. But I'm happy to say that ever since the National Security Council Secretariat opened up its public call for comments, we have seen incredible willingness on the part of policymakers to get inputs, not just from industry, but also academia and civil society. I feel that almost as if every few months, our National Cybersecurity Coordinator will drop one nugget of information about, oh, you can expect this to be a part of the strategy. And I'm absolutely thrilled to share with you one of the newer nuggets that he shared was at a webinar last week. I believe it was GeoSmart India that organized something on defense and intelligence in India, where we've seen General Pant talk about a three-tiered model or a conceptualization of how we understand what is meant by Indian cyberspace. And I'm incredibly proud to say that this three-tiered model is something that we at the Center for Communication Governance had suggested to the coordinator in our comments. So that has come, we can expect this to be a part of the strategy where, while India continues to espouse the goal of a free, sovereign, free, open, and secure internet, there's also enough room being built in the strategy to create, islands of sovereignty to protect sensitive information that the government is clearly struggling to at this time, as far as the threat, as far as the Chinese threat goes, because we have seen this. We have seen this play out last year with the power blackout in Bombay that lasted almost 2 days as a result of a cyber attack. And there were, of course, different versions of attribution that came from those who were close to the site of the incident and those who are policymakers at the center. And we don't have an explicit attribution on this on this respect at all. And I think it is kind of it's certainly a spin-off of the fact that we are acutely aware of the strategic implications that attach to such cyber security incidents. I believe terms including gray zone coercion and hybrid warfare have been thrown around by a lot of commentators. And to a certain extent, I would agree with them. But I think up to a point, we do need to recognize and distinguish between the state actors as entities that pose a threat to cybersecurity versus non-state actors that pose a threat to India's cybersecurity. And this is a distinction, again, I'm hoping that the strategy will elaborate upon, considering, again, General Pant has mentioned that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, again, a suggestion put forth by CCG to the Secretariat, will be espoused in the cybersecurity strategy. And what is unique about the principle of CBDR, which I'm sure you would be aware is finds its origins in international climate change law and a principle that governs sharing of responsibilities in global commons. So we can see that there is a particular kind of thinking that is developing around how to govern what we understand as Indian cyberspace. So while the aspiration is to continue to remain connected with the free, open, global internet, there's also room for little islands of sovereignty here. And while thinking about this island of sovereignty, I think the first feature that pops to mind is that this is the area of, or rather the segment of your cyberspace that is going to be most vehemently guarded and protected against. And that's certainly the hope. But of course, a natural spin-off effect of that, I suspect, is going to be a decline in transparency. We've seen this with the kind of curious case that has developed around India's fluctuating cybersecurity rankings, which leads us to, question what are the parameters being looked at to decide which countries are at a certain level of having amassed what one might call cyber power. Abhiyan, you will remember my short comments on the index that the Belfer Center had come out with last year. And many of our audience might recall a more recent study by the International Institute for Strategic Studies that labeled India as a third tier power in cyberspace, which did not go down well with the establishment. We all know that. But surprisingly, only a few days after this kind of ranking, we also saw the ITU come out with its cybersecurity rankings. And to my amazement, I think India ranks among the top 10 countries by the ITU index. So it does lead one to, question what are the parameters that we're looking at. So if you delve a little bit deeper into the ITU's report, you realize that India has actually scored exceptionally high marks in the strategy part of the parameters that the ITU looks at. So this leads us to think a little bit more about, if the ITU knows about this strategy, then where is this strategy that we speak of? Because prima facie, it seems that it was sufficient for the ITU to be assured that there is a strategy, even if it may be confidential, it exists in some way, shape or form. And this is in fact very consistent with another finding that we reached in a related research project that is currently ongoing, is that the 2013 National Cybersecurity Policy was actually not the first time our government articulated a cybersecurity policy. Our first policy, in fact, goes back to 2010. And this was a document that remained confidential for 3 years until the 2013 policy was actually released. So I think I'm going to end on a positive note and say that, the hope is that we will not wait as long, which is 3 years, to come up with the newer revised version of the policy. I think we've already waited about 21 months for its release. And I think just an articulation of the strategy is bound to give us a louder voice as far as international fora on cyber norms are concerned. India has certainly been participating in the norms formation process. There's no two ways about that. But I think more than I would, instead of looking at the question of do we have an adequate voice, I would frame it as one of, is our voice loud enough to be heard in the kind of noise that we see in these fora? Because I'm sure my colleagues from the Asia Pacific will agree that capacity building is something that we all as a region really need to work on. I think India is looking at a shortage of about 3.5 million personnel, and that is going to be the extent of cybersecurity skills shortage that we're plagued with even before the year is over. So skilling and rapid skilling, knowledge sharing, capacity building, I think are some of the less controversial rubrics under which we can foster and we can hope to foster cooperation and build the kind of collaboration that clearly all nations in the region need. Of course, the threats may be slightly different in their nature or source, but the way out of this conundrum is a pretty, path-dependent strategy that you're looking at, because you could focus as much as you want on the technical component, getting the the most advanced state-of-the-art high-tech gear that your army, military, or law enforcement need to carry out their day-to-day functions. But again, without the human element in ensuring cybersecurity, without building that capacity, I think the rocky lands are not very likely to smoothen out into fertile plains anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments, Gunjan. Turning to you, Elena, how do you assess how Southeast Asia is looking at cyber issues? And what I want to know from you also is, how is the China-US rivalry shaping how the region looks at these issues, if at all, right? And it would also be great if you could tell us how high cyber ranks as an issue for countries and businesses around the region, in terms of to what extent are regional businesses alert to risks emerging out of a greater volume of business transactions being conducted online.
Thanks, Abi. Let me try to answer those three questions of yours with three observations of mine about the cyber landscape in Southeast Asia. My first point is this, that Southeast Asia remains bullish on tech, despite or perhaps because of COVID-19 last year through to this year. So I think your report points out that there were about 40 million new internet users in the region added just last year. But in addition to that, the digital economies of 5 countries in Southeast Asia also grew quite exponentially, reaching $100 billion. And if current trajectories hold, this figure is projected to triple by 2025. I mean, the region is also home to 2 decacorns, a few unicorns, who knows what other mythical creatures, depending on your method of calculating valuation. At the government level, there are also numerous policies, both at the individual member state level of ASEAN, but also at the ASEAN level itself. So at the individual state level, you have, for example, Singapore Smart Nation, Indonesia's National AI Strategy, Thailand 4.0, which includes the development of a tech cluster and future industries, and Malaysia 5.0, which is supposed to be anchored on emerging tech. At the ASEAN level, you have initiatives like the ASEAN Smart Cities Network, as well as a consolidated strategy on the 4th Industrial Revolution in the pipeline. So what you have across the 3 main levels of government, business, and individual consumer is this embrace and this exuberance of a digitalized future, even though there is a very sober realization that has been made more acute by COVID-19 of the deep disparities in digital access, infrastructure, capacity, and capabilities within each Southeast Asian country, but also across and throughout the whole region. And this is where Gunjan's point about capacity building remains very salient. My second point relates to the region's gaps and challenges in cyberspace. Given the uptrend in the digital economy, there's also been a correlating rise in cybercrime figures. Gunjan pointed this out, but specifically in Southeast Asia, what you've seen are incidents of phishing, business email compromise, and ransomware, which have been significant threats in the region. In the first 3 quarters of last year alone in 2020, Kaspersky detected about 2.7 million ransomware counts in the region. And of the 10 ASEAN member countries, Indonesia accounted for almost half the entire detections, about 1.3 million counts. So there remains this great need for cyber hygiene, for basic fundamentals of cybersecurity. But apart from that, the region will also have to finesse cross-border coordination and harmonization details, with a number of connectivity projects increasing around critical infrastructure throughout the region. And one good example is the ASEAN Power Grid. Additionally, as the discussion rages on in international forums about how exactly norms and international law will apply in specific situations, ASEAN member states will also have to consider these issues individually as states and collectively as a regional grouping, taking into account their very different legal traditions, their historical context, and of course, future interests in this fast evolving space, including AI, the Internet of Everything and Everybody, all the other acronyms related to tech. let me get to this point about the US-China competition. The region will also have to navigate all these risks that are overlaid now with pressures of this major power competition in the cyber domain, not just with regard to supply chain availability and resilience, but also in relation to how Southeast Asia will manage extensive APT, advanced persistent threat campaigns that may start off as tactical operations, but morph into a strategic advantage, eventually resulting in kinetic or physical clashes 5 to 15 years down the road. Remember, the region, because of its strategic location, is also a potential flashpoint in parts in the land, air, and space and maritime domains as well. Now, my third and final point is this. Because of all the risks, the varied risks that I've sketched out, the region has actually been quite forward-looking on the issue of norms in cyberspace as kind of an interim measure before the whole world tries to figure out how international law applies in specific situations. ASEAN was the first regional grouping to adopt, in principle, the 11 norms of the UN Group of Governmental Experts report in 2015. Those norms relate to responsible state behavior. ASEAN is now in the process of developing a regional action plan on the implementation of these norms. And it will prioritize the implementation of these norms, apparently according to member states' readiness and interests. We're still awaiting the details of this, but I think this is a good sign. And a large part of this movement can be attributed to Singapore's leadership with, for example, the establishment of the ASEAN-Singapore Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, as well as the capacity building support and assistance of regional partners such as Japan, Australia, China, the United States, and European partners, as well as others elsewhere. But I think it's also to the credit of the less technologically mature ASEAN member states with far more pressing non-cyber priorities to treat the issue of norms in cyberspace and other cyber-related issues as seriously as some of its more technologically mature neighbors. So let me stop here, and I'd be very happy to take questions or comments later.
Thank you so much, Elena, for your remarks. And it was very interesting how you compared some of the issues that Southeast Asia is facing with Buyin's remark about South Asia. So that gives us a holistic picture. Justin, coming to you, can you please provide us a broad overview of how China, US, and Russia, the great powers, quote unquote, are looking at cyber issues? Is geopolitics the sole determinant of how these countries are calibrating the cyber postures? I'm especially interested in your views about Russia and how Russia is approaching its cyber activities and its strategy of what has been called implausible deniability.
Certainly, and to echo my fellow panelists, thanks again to DRI for putting this together, and it's great to be here with such a distinguished group. So I think this has come out a few times now. I think it's worth underscoring when we're talking about the Chinese or US-Russian cyber relationship, which is that, of course, we see these technologies having impacts at the geopolitical level, but what we're increasingly seeing in these three countries, as well as elsewhere, is a greater appreciation within the government for making that a part of geopolitical planning and strategy formation. And so even if we look at, for example, Russia, where in the early 2000s, there was really not a lot of high-level strategy discussion in the Kremlin about the internet. There was some military use of cyber operations in the later half of that decade, but it wasn't really a key strategic issue. Versus now, all the time in the press in Russia and other places, Putin is commenting on this. It's a Security Council issue. And we've seen the same thing in the US, right? To give another example with that. So we have to think about that lens as we approach this. But the US foreign policy apparatus, I would say, or at least the Biden administration right now, is of the belief that the US is in great power competition with China and with Russia. And so, at least on the technology side, we certainly see competitive and coercive elements of cyber used, whether this is a range of independent, state-backed, state-linked actors in China that conduct intellectual property theft from US businesses, to election interference operations run out of Russia by state-funded outlets, to Chinese government influence campaigns in Taiwan and elsewhere, to, of course, the various ways in the US that it's increasingly difficult, I would say, actually, to talk about anything in the realm of internet policy or tech regulation without somebody bringing up China. And maybe we can talk more about that, because that's an opportunity and a challenge at the same time. But we also see efforts by these two states, China and Russia, to reshape global cyberspace in their images. And I think this is really important, because we often tend to separate sort of internet governance questions from cyber conflict questions, and there's actually a lot of entanglement between them. And so the other thing I'll note, I guess, quickly, is that they're not the same, the way that China and Russia behave towards reshaping the internet. All too often, I think the Chinese government's model for the internet, so to speak, is taken as the only model of internet repression, tech authoritarianism, what have you. And that's not necessarily the case. But all to say, right, we see the Chinese government pushing for greater state control of standards at the ITU, at the UN. We see the Russian government pushing a new cyber treaty in the UN. And actually, the Russian government, it was 2 or 3 weeks ago now, released a new 69-page cyber treaty. I did a Wired column on it, you can read, but essentially they've kickstarted this process in the UN where, because they got a vote in December 2019 that passed, the UN is now required to consider new submissions for an international cyber treaty. And so previously, where Russia would file these cyber codes of conduct, they would call them, with China, with North Korea, with Iran, with other dictatorships, and a lot of free and open internet supporters would sort of swat them away and kind of ignore them. Now there's actually been this process kickstarted, so that's something else. Not to mention, there's a lot of fusion between China and Russia that I think we sort of lose when we focus, again, a lot just on the US-China bilateral relationship. Huawei, for example, as the US has continued to levy and expand sanctions against the company, has made huge inroads into Russia. In the last 18 months, they've done anything from partnering with Yandex, a huge internet search giant, to partnering with big banks on mobile plans, to meeting with Russian state officials to figure out how they can use Huawei equipment instead of Western-made equipment in their infrastructure. And so there's a lot of interesting complexity and entanglement, especially in the supply chains, like the other panelists have hinted at and talked about there as well. So, you know, there's various developments that have shifted that I'll highlight quickly. Under the Obama administration, right, there was an agreement between the US and China on intellectual property theft through cyberspace. This was very narrowly framed, but it appeared that briefly this curtailed the amount of IP theft that Chinese actors were engaging in from US companies. That completely collapsed under the Trump administration, and so that's a big issue in the US-China tech relationship, again, is how the Biden administration is going to address that. In terms of US-Russia, Biden met with Putin in Geneva in June. The biggest thing to me out of this summit was that they agreed to hold future lower-level cyber dialogues, meaning essentially get a bunch of diplomats, maybe some defense officials, some others together to do any number of working sessions. They might talk through so-called red lines. They might actually sit with government strategies and talk through questions they have to clarify misunderstandings. So this was something that happened a lot under the Obama administration. This was something that diminished again under the Trump administration. But we see a continued problem from the US perspective, at least, with Russian cybercrime and Russian cyber actors, where we have massive ransomware attacks launched by non-state groups out of Russia, even after Putin publicly says that he's going to crack down on this activity, and yet it persists. And as I said, despite the US-China focus, there's again a complicated relationship between China and Russia. For example, I would point out some interesting writing recently by Russian cybersecurity folks about security concerns with Huawei equipment and security concerns about Chinese technology. And so even though I would assess that there's sort of a greater distrust of Western tech, there is also concern about Beijing and its technological prowess. as well. And then just quickly on the defensive side, right, we see major vulnerabilities persisting in infrastructure in the US and Russia and China. As you know, as with many countries, when you push to digitize your critical infrastructure systems, when you are linking hospitals to IoT, when you're putting electrical grids on remote internet connected monitoring systems, you're really increasing your vulnerability. And so we've seen that problem during COVID with lots of ransomware attacks against hospitals and lots of cybercrime problems there as well. And these countries have done various things to improve cybersecurity. The Biden administration has done a lot. China's making various pushes for more security standards for products. The Russian government actually has not really done much. They've sort of been flailing in various ways, but I'll just say there's a lot of entanglement there. And I think we really need to remember that there's a lot more, you know, Russia-China elements and other things going on than we might typically see in the headlines.
Thank you so much, Justin, for your remarks and that overview of how the great powers' cyber postures seem to be entangled and mostly reactive. There's an action-reaction dynamic that is driving the strategies and their postures. You know, first of all, to folks joining us for this webinar, please send in your questions through the Q&A feature in the app. And while you do, I'll take a moment to ask a question of my own for all three of you, which is, you know, Gunjan, right in the beginning, in your remarks, you talked about the prospect of cyber cooperation. And I want to dig a little deeper into this and ask all three of you, is cyber cooperation under the shadow of intense strategic competition even possible? And if it is possible, what kind of cyber cooperation can we expect going forward, both between countries that are big as well as small?
Thanks, Abhi. That's actually a great question, because I think cooperation is one of the things that all of us want, but none of us really know how to effectuate. I think you're kind of somewhat on point when you say that it is certainly going to be fraught with strategic considerations, and I think not to point fingers or find someone to blame for this, but it's very noticeable, this new trend, and among Western scholars in particularly, where, and I agree that it is a problem every time a cyber attack happens, your policymakers are going to start crying cyber war, and that is really not what's happening. But I think the viewpoint that is being propagated is that cyber warfare in its essence is an intelligence contest. Now, it's a great headline. It's very catchy. It seems to make sense to those in the intelligence community, certainly also to those who've dealt with military cyber operations. But I think speaking as a person who's deeply embedded in civilian life rather than military, I would say that viewing cyber warfare as an intelligence contest is invariably going to have the effect of increasing the realm of your public affairs that remain opaque and beyond public scrutiny. And I think without that transparency, people-to-people cooperation on cyber issues can be hampered very, very easily. Because we can see that a lot of breaches, in fact, have been brought to light by private citizens and cybersecurity researchers. And individuals play an extremely important role in this kind of setup, where the state is either functioning on ad hoc arrangements or through, part-time consultancy contracts to get the information that they need to be able to function in a way that makes them feel reasonably secure as far as their information security goes. But when we talk about cyber cooperation, it's unimaginable without, at least I would say that the most rudimentary form of cooperation here would be sharing information on vulnerabilities. To some extent, mechanisms already exist for this, and we already see this in the kind of advisory notes and warnings that come from whether CERT-In or NCIPC. We do rely heavily on the kind of advisories that CISA under the DHS puts out in the US, or even Kaspersky for that matter. There are, and I could go on naming other entities that help us see and kind of predict potential risks down the road a little bit better. But I think when the asymmetry of power kind of decreases, the willingness to share information also decreases along with that. Wherever there's a sense of rivalry, there will of course be a lot of hesitation to share information. But that said, I don't think that is a problem that plagues the Asia-Pacific region as such. I think CERT-In has CERT-In, as far as CERT-In is concerned, they take great pride in being a part of the Asia-Pacific CERT, which is a conglomerate of all computer emergency response teams working in the organization, working in the region. Well, to sum up, vulnerability certainly is one point. Threat assessment, sharing of threat intelligence is more on the incident response side of things. But I think at the risk of repeating myself, I will say that none of this cooperation is going to bear results until we start to cooperate in capacity building exercises, and to do so in good faith. Now, why I say in good faith at the end of it is for a very specific reason, and because we saw recently at the discussions that happened with the open-ended working group at the United Nations, you can see that there is a clear split between member states on how to understand and implement capacity building exercises. There's on the one hand, there is a fear on the part of more technologically mature nation states that these kind of practices might encourage free riding, and states may not necessarily bear the costs of building that capacity as much as they would have minus that cooperation. But then on the other end of the spectrum, there is also a concern among the less technologically mature states. And thank you so much, Alina, for giving me that vocabulary to go beyond just cyber security maturity. I think it's really important to think of societies and countries as technologically mature or nascent. So where we have a more nascent state of play in the society, there is also, of course, a worry of if cyber warfare is an intelligence contest, then if a foreign country is coming to tell us how to do cyber warfare, you need to be a little bit cautious about what their agenda and what their priorities are in capacity building and where those efforts might be directed. So there's certainly a level of distrust that we must deal with, and this distrust is not unique to the cyber environment now, is it? Any international relations scholar could probably write a whole thesis on how distrust is the foundation of any foreign policy that you might come up with. So I suppose the limitation around our ability to cooperate is, of course, how much or how little we trust each other as countries.
Elena?
Yeah, let me piggyback off Gunjan's point about this very necessary wariness about the intention behind capacity building sometimes. And I think this was very clearly reflected in particularly the OEWG final statement, right? You had a lot of countries that expressed this distrust for capacity building, offers of help and support. And I think the statement very clearly, said something along the lines of how there needs to be a respect for the receiving countries' priorities, their needs, their capacity. And basically it has to be dependent on what the country is asking for that support need and what they're capable of absorbing. On this point, ASEAN has taken a very inclusive approach, as it usually tends to do, to avoid conflict. And so it has received support and assistance from adversarial countries at the great power level, Just last year, ASEAN and China held its first cyber dialogue, and it was co-chaired by the Philippines and China. So I think that's pretty telling, given that the Philippines took China to the PCA on the South China Sea dispute. And one thing that stood out for me from the statement that came out of that dialogue was this nod from ASEAN of China's efforts, appreciation for China's efforts on cybersecurity in general, but there was a particular mention for China's proposal of this global initiative on data security, which in some ways was kind of a counter proposal to the Trump administration's Clean Network Initiative. So within ASEAN, there is a range of agnosticism and right up to disdain for this great power competition, forcing countries in the region to choose not just on infrastructure, but also on ideology. And so there's this distrust again for this great power competition impeding on cyber cooperation. My final point with regard to this question is that it is very important, just to underscore what I said earlier, for countries in Southeast Asia to know what they want. And very often, because of this exuberance that I talked about for the digital economy in ASEAN, there may be a tendency to copy and paste models from abroad. And we've had examples of where this has been very disastrous at the end of the day. Countries copying and pasting models, not fitting at all to their local context. And so in the pursuit for all things digital in ASEAN, I think there needs to be capacity building and raising awareness of what exactly countries themselves need and want from their partners beyond the region.
Justin, you want to add your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree so much with what was just said. I don't know how much I have to add. Yeah, I would iterate again, right? I mean, I think the state buy-in is such an important thing. And as the two other panelists said, sort of really getting a granular understanding of what states want and what they want out of capacity building is really important, because I'm just not convinced that, you know, it sounds great, but like Microsoft Cyber Peace Treaty and all these people sign and say, we're not going to cyber attack anyone. And then they say we've achieved cyber, like just that stuff just does not work. So I think the state buy-in is really an important thing. And as was said with capacity building, you've got some real challenges with, right, under the, as Lena just said, under the Trump administration, there was a huge drive, it's us or it's China, right, as sort of the framing of all geopolitical interaction. I mean, it was extremely like reductive and zero sum and all these things, right? But I worry to some extent that the Biden administration is intentionally or not implicitly replicating that dynamic. And I've written at length about this, but I think that, for example, to get outside the Asia Pacific for a second, but like the US and the EU just stood up a tech council. And there's lots of things in there about what we've been talking about, capacity building, cybersecurity. It's very focused on China. Implicitly, the entire thing is oriented around countering Chinese action rather than thinking about, separate from Beijing, what proactively should we do to promote a free and open internet, to boost capacity building in, you know, lower resource countries, historically exploited regions, right? Things of that nature. There's even now, I think, with this push, even in the Asia Pacific from the administration, to have a democracies versus authoritarians tech framing, it still ends up being about China. And you have things like when Secretary of State Blinken recently visited India, or when the Secretary of Defense visited India, not a lot of public raising of internet shutdowns, of surveillance and censorship from the Modi government, all these things, right? Because the focus is we need India on board to counter China. So I'll just say, I really think that's a great point. And I think that dynamic is not as strong and as clumsy as it was in the Trump administration, but I think it's still there. And then the other thing I'll add is, I think, right, it of course depends on, as Gunjan was saying earlier, about, are you coming to the table in good faith? And I think the last 3 to 4 months, particularly of the US-Russia cyber relationship engagement, show this, where, you know, as I said, the US and Russia agreed to have lower level cyber dialogues. And then they had a couple reportedly, and then Russia's deputy foreign minister came out and said, oh, this has been going really well. We're glad we're having this. Why don't we broaden this discussion beyond ransomware? And so you start to see, as they've done this before, which is the conversation is relatively narrowly scoped, which I think is a good thing when you're trying to forge cooperation between adversarial states in cyber. And they're trying to expand to include espionage and military cyber operations and all kinds of other things that the Russians call cybercrime, for example. Same thing with their recent cyber treaty. They talk a lot about cooperation between states, about threat sharing. And towards the end, there's an entire section on extradition, which is that if someone outside of Russia who maybe is an expat or lives here and went abroad commits what we call a cybercrime, which in Russia can be insulting the government, spreading LGBTQ content, any other number of things, they're going to get extradited back to Russia. So you see this sort of bad faith engagement there, and I think that's just a perfect example of exactly why we need that, really strong state buy-in.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for your thoughts. A colleague who couldn't join us today because it's a holiday in India, as it turns out, she had a question for all three of you. And the question was about how different regions in the Asia-Pacific look at the importance of disinformation campaigns. And in terms of problems to counter vis-a-vis, let's say, ransomware or other kinds of cybercrime. So how high does South Asia rank disinformation as a cyber issue? How high does Southeast Asia rank cyber disinformation as a cause of concern? And finally, Justin, we know what the position of the United States has been about disinformation campaigns because of the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections. Buyin, you want to start with the...
Sorry, I didn't realize you called on me. I was just quickly making
notes.
Apologies. Disinformation as a cyber issue. I feel like you've kind of inadvertently stepped on a little nerve there, Abhi. For the simple reason that I don't quite subscribe to the view that disinformation is a cyber security problem. I think disinformation has roots that are, of course, far more sociological and political than they are technological, I would say. That said, it's not that technology doesn't play a role, of course. We know that social media networks enable the acceleration of the pace at which bad or misleading or deliberately misleading information circulates around the web. But I think there's more harm to be done to civil liberties and fundamental freedoms than benefiting the general information environment in a society if we treat disinformation as a cyber issue. I mean, that's certainly not to minimize the significance of this issue, but just to give you an example, and I think this is very topical in India right now, right? I mean, we've seen months of par tussles between social media companies and the government on, what are the appropriate expected rules of conduct for social media intermediaries as far as circulation of messages is concerned. And disinformation, of course, is a huge part of it, right? Because you can trigger takedown provisions under the IT Act based on the fact that a particular piece of content is deliberately misleading, can incite discontent or disharmony or disrupt public order in any way. And that's and the fact that public order gets confused with national security is a whole other issue I could spend an evening talking about. But without going there, I think it's sufficient to say that it kind of takes us back to the point that you made, Justin, on how issues in cybersecurity and internet governance are often conflated considered completely different, but have more overlaps than we would like to admit so far. So of course, the kind of controversies that we've seen around, Twitter being made to take down certain kinds of content, certain content not being taken down from other platforms, these are if we think of them in a purely legal sense, these are questions of intermediary liability, right? And questions of intermediary liability and the extent to which such intermediaries can claim protection against the content that they host but do not generate is a very different conversation to be had if we compare it with a conversation that considers, the mention of the word disinformation as a trigger that's sufficient to allow for takedowns. Because a huge, I won't hesitate to call it a conflict of interest here, is that very often those requesting the takedown are the ones who are also creating this kind of information pollution in the ecosystem. So I would be very wary of mixing disinformation with cyber issues without diminishing the importance of either. I know that there has been a certain push at the UN level to kind of talk about these issues, and a huge reason for that is, of course, the events leading up to the election of Donald Trump as president in 2016. So, of course, there is a bit of conflation of issues that are interconnected but have completely different solutions and implications.
Elena?
Yeah, so I'm going to dodge the classification minefield, and I don't want to appear very smug, but I think for countries in Southeast Asia, this issue of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, what were previously content issues, I think, they have always been very, very important because of the nature of many of the Southeast Asian nations, and particularly the diverse nature, multi-ethnic, multi-faith countries. And so hate speech, seditious speech, those kinds of things, yes, they were tools of control by some of the political establishment, but it's also a crucial part of maintaining racial harmony and political stability, whether you agree with how it was executed or not. I think, though, where misinformation and disinformation really make an impact is in conflict situations, and it can actually exacerbate exponentially in speed and threat how conflicts are carried out. And you see a prime example of this right now happening in Myanmar. So for Southeast Asia, it is a very real concern. It remains a very real concern. And I think to a certain extent, up until 2016, this was not really acknowledged as an issue in cyberspace by Western countries, unfortunately, because it was always seen as more of a freedom expression issue.
Justin, this one's going to be probably easy for you, but yeah, your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, concur with what was said. I think, right, without, to use my fellow panelists' words, without diminishing the importance of the issue, it's not just a cyber issue, right? There have been plenty of studies done in various countries, actually, about how social media is not the primary vector for various kinds of misinformation, whether that was COVID, and you had, numerous countries in Africa, some countries in the Asia-Pacific, where Europe even, where leaders or politicians are getting up and just lying about COVID. And so the TV is the main way it spreads. In the US in 2020, and still now, we have lots of elected Republican officials who lie about election results and things like that. And there were studies done where Twitter and Facebook were not the main way that was spread. It was, again, TV, it was things getting printed in newspapers, it was people going to like political rallies. So I would agree with that. And I think we just have to remember how these terms are so politicized, of course, right? So as we've been talking about with capacity building and other things, they mean very different things to different countries, but some countries, again, are outright bad faith when they talk about disinformation and are going to outright label any criticism of the state or reporting on things the state doesn't want reported on as disinformation. And so that sort of muddies the waters as well.
We have two audience questions. It seems both are directed at Elena, and they have to do with the use of Chinese telecom equipment by the Philippines, given the dispute, the geopolitical disputes between the two around the South China Sea. One question is specifically about how does Philippines, that's my understanding of the question, how does the Philippines allow the use of Chinese equipment, knowing that there is this, that China had disregarded the tribunal decision about the South China Sea. And the other one is about the positioning of these equipment on sensitive Filipino territory and installations.
Yeah, well, my answer is probably going to be unsatisfactory because all I'll say is that it's for every country to decide what equipment or networks they install. And I'm sure there's been due diligence exercises conducted. All I will say is that I will caution against imposing a binary view and a simplistic one of the choices that countries make, especially if you're observing things from the outside. So a prime example, when Singapore decided against going with Chinese provider for its 5G, when Malaysia in the end eventually decided to go with Ericsson, there were all these comments about, oh, well, this is good for the US because it portends greater alignment in Southeast Asia with the US versus China. Many of these observations were coming from outside the region. And I think the situation and the explanation was much more complex than was often portrayed. And it's really important to take into account these nuances and complexities because there are other considerations apart from geopolitical ones, very practical economic considerations, as well as a whole bunch of other issues that go into some of these decisions.
Thank you for that, Elena. My last question, we have only a couple of minutes, is going to be for Gunjan. Gunjan, you mentioned our propensity, Indian government's propensity to release the cyber strategy in small packets, as if they're like movie trailers. I want you to tell us a little bit more about how extant problems with national security decision making in Delhi has ended up spilling over or translating to such bottlenecks, even when it comes to a cyber strategy. So the issue is not just about the lack of, for example, a national security strategy. India does not have one, or it has one, but it's under lock and key, so I'm told. So how does this sort of back and forth and lack of strategic direction, how has it spilled over into the cyber domain?
That's a really great question, because I don't very often get to talk about civilian military relations in the country, which I think are at the core of good cybersecurity. We know from the American experience that your intelligence agencies had better cyber capabilities than the military at one point. And to bring about that change took a lot of, well, let's call it reform. Whereas in our case, I think that pattern seems to be replicating, although of course there's not enough publicly available evidence to say that with 100% confidence. But I think it is reasonable to surmise that our intelligence agencies have far better cyber capabilities than our military does. As far as the military goes, we do run into some legal issues as well in trying to operationalize jointness in the armed forces, because we do, I don't think we've reached the point of where, we consider cyberspace as a theater for conflict. We're still thinking of the cyber medium as a tool to kind of create seamless modes of communication across the three wings of the armed forces, which right now function in I think General Huda's words in vertical stovepipes, and are completely separated from each other. And this is part of our colonial legacy, that we have a separate legislation for the army, a separate one for the Air Force, a separate one for the Navy. So when the three forces act together in, let's say, a joint cyber operation, who gives commands to whom, it remains an unanswered question. And that kind of stokes the pre-existing inter-services rivalries, which we're all somewhat familiar with, and we've seen that play out in the last 3-4 years a lot more than we have before. So, I mean, just to, I'm sorry, to come back to what your point was, how this spills over into civilian governance of cyber. Again, I will take it back to our conversation on cyber warfare as an intelligence contest. We are not looking at cyber as purely a means to achieve military technological superiority, nor have we given a full-on push to, you know, what many might call GovTech, and the kind of technological systems such as the open data ecosystems that the government has been talking about, don't really have conversations around cybersecurity, because I would say that cybersecurity has been treated as such a highly sensitive, intelligence-specific matter, when it is not. We know from many sources of statistics on cybercrime that in at least, I would say, 80, if not 90% of cases of cyber attacks and incidents, including ransomware, including phishing, the motive has been economic. And so how the military deals with a cyber threat is certainly not the same as how law enforcement should be thinking about cyber threat and cybercrime. How a cyber attack affects an individual, whether they're a security researcher, whether they're a small or medium business enterprise, whether they're a member of civil society, is very different to how cyber attacks would affect the military or the government establishment. And I think that is a distinction we have not yet been able to draw very clearly. But all hope is not lost. I'm still very optimistic about how the Cybersecurity Coordinator's Office and the government in general, I would say, interprets this principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So far, we've seen in one of the packets that have been dropped that there is that this is going to be part of the strategy, and that's great. And the point of incorporating this is not going to be the same as it is in international environment law, right, which apportions responsibilities among states that are members of the international community. As opposed to that, the cyber strategy is looking to apportion responsibilities between the public and the private sector as far as cybersecurity governance goes. And I think to a very limited extent, we have seen the logic of differentiation play out in the new IT rules, where some, you know, it's very easy to miss, but I would say that it's quite a leap forward in thinking about governing technologies, where we're distinguishing between social media intermediaries and significant social media intermediaries. Now, there is a logic to it. It may not be approved or appreciated by everyone, but it stands to reason that a social media intermediary cannot be regulated in the same way that an e-commerce website can be regulated or a Google can be regulated. So the hope is that in whittling down these bases for distinguishing between, you know, I don't want to use big tech, but well, there's few words to replace that, right? Big tech and medium tech and small tech and startups and unicorns and all the other, again, to borrow from Melina, mythical creatures that come along with it. And hopefully the individual is going to figure somewhere in that scheme. I don't expect it to be in the language of fundamental freedoms or human rights, but I think, again, going back to the economic motives of cyber criminals and the purpose of cybersecurity being in one way or another economic self-defense, if you will indulge me with that term, it stands to reason that individuals do have a right to ensure their own safety and well-being as far as interacting with this medium is concerned. So I hope I didn't digress too much from what the focus of your question was in my enthusiasm in talking about CBDR.
No, no, thank you for your remarks, Gunjan, and also the hopeful note to end this this webinar. Thank you all three of you for your thoughtful remarks, and thank you all of our listeners and viewers who have joined us around the world for the inaugural edition of DRI Majlis, the Diplomat Risk Intelligence's monthly webinar. Thanks.
Thank you.